Hello and welcome to Autistic Changeling. Today I'm going to talk about headcanons. So if you're not familiar with fandom jargon, a quick rundown. Canon is anything that's made clear in the source material, and sometimes, but not always, includes what's known as Word of God, which is just anything the creator says that doesn't show up in the source material. So, for example, if I wrote a story and a character said at some point that they were autistic, that would be canon. If I wrote a story with the intention that a character was autistic but didn't say it anywhere and then later said on Twitter or in an interview or something, character X is autistic, that would be Word of God, and some people would consider it canon and some people wouldn't. But I'm not talking about either of those things. I'm talking about headcanons, which is something that you believe or pretend about the source material that isn't actually stated anywhere in the material. People might argue about whether something is a headcanon if it directly contradicts the source material or not, but I'm not getting into that much detail here. Basically, when I say headcanon, I just mean anything that you choose to believe or even pretend if it counteracts canon about something. But I'm talking specifically in this video about headcanons that characters are autistic, or autistic headcanons. I'm talking about these when they're done by autistic people because we're the ones who come up with most of them. Sometimes they catch on among a few neurotypical or autistic people, but for the most part, the vast majority of autistic headcanons I see are by autistic people. Because for the most part, headcanons, and I think this is true of autistic headcanons and other types of headcanons that fall into the character X is this specific marginalized identity sort of a category. These headcanons are, I think, because we don't have sufficient actual representation. And that's the first point I want to make, is that headcanons don't replace actual representation. I think they come about both because they're sort of an inherent part of how people interact with fandom a lot of the time, but also because they're meant to supplement representation that we're not really getting. And that's unfortunate, I like headcanons because they help a little bit, but I want actual representation. Like, you can't just look at something and say, well, some people have headcanoned it, so we don't need to actually work on improving the representation. That's not at all what I'm trying to say here. So, yeah, headcanons, I think, come about a lot of the time because representation isn't adequate. And I think that you can learn a lot about what's missing from mainstream representation by looking at the sorts of headcanons that people can come up with. For example, a lot of mainstream media representations of autistic people include mostly white men or boys. A lot of them are children. I think that's changing a little bit, but a lot of older ones specifically are white men or children. And headcanons include a lot more diversity than that in terms of characters' ages and genders and race, and that's all very important. And also other things like personality, it is very common to headcanon the characters who are coded as other, sort of as autistic, I think because autistic people tend to relate to that sort of an archetype, just by virtue of having difficulty in social situations, and maybe feeling excluded. So those characters tend to be more relatable, and when you relate to a character, you want to sort of project your own traits onto them sometimes, and that's why it's more common to headcanon characters you relate to as being autistic as compared to some character you don't care about. So those do show up a lot, but you also see headcanons of characters who are more outgoing and extroverted. Like, for example, I headcanon Tony Stark as autistic because I like him, although I would buy an ADHD headcanon too, but I'm not ADHD, so I headcanon him as autistic because that's what I am. And, characters who aren't the stereotypical autistic person might show up in headcanons, and that's sort of a sign that, like, we need more diversity in personalities of canon autistic people. Another big thing that I want to talk about is the fact that, when you headcanon a character as autistic, it's a character who already has a storyline and a plot line and a background that aren't related to being autistic, because the character isn't explicitly mentioned to be autistic in any canon or Word of God material, which isn't necessarily, an intentional thing. I mean, it's just sort of how headcanons work. But it does make me think about how a lot of canon representation of autistic people seems to fall into mostly one category with maybe a second category sometimes. So it's either stories about where the entire plot is about the character being disabled and either how much of a burden they are or them being inspirational. I'm not a fan of those stories. They're most of what's out there. The other one is where the character is autistic, but it's never shown anywhere. It's not super relevant. They might have mentioned it once to get some representation points in there, and then it never comes up again. And that's less common, and honestly not as annoying, but it's still kind of annoying, because if they're autistic, it should be, it should be a part of the character, and the characterization should show that. And I think that's kind of a lot of what's out there. And that's a shame, because I think there should be autistic characters who are in stories that have an actual plot line happening other than them being autistic, but also have them being autistic, part of their personality and their character traits, and have that, mentioned when it's relevant. And sometimes when it's not, just like you would include irrelevant characterization for other characters. I want to see autistic characters in science fiction and fantasy and random comedy shows or whatever people watch that isn't science fiction and fantasy. I don't know, I like sci-fi. But, I want to see autistic characters in those types of shows and movies and have them be autistic and recognizably autistic, but also have that not turn into a storyline about overcoming disability or some other thing like that. And we don't have very much of that right now. So I think that's something that headcanons sort of do a little bit, is they can take a story that has an established plot line that isn't just, your standard, we need to do something about disability sort of a plot line, and include a disabled character and have that be relevant to the story, but not the only thing in the story. And I think that's something that mainstream media really struggles with. As far as headcanons go, I think there's several different types of autistic headcanons. Honestly, for the most part, at least for me, it's just, I like this character, and I want to think of them as being like me, so I'm going to pretend they're autistic. But, some people put more thought into it than I do and actually have whole lists of reasons and make posts and stuff. And I think there's some backlash sometimes to the idea of headcanoning characters as autistic. And I personally haven't seen too much backlash because I don't know, I curate my fandom spaces and don't see that kind of stuff, I guess. But I have seen people talk about receiving backlash, and I think, well, first I think it's headcanons, it's just live and let live, but also, and I've seen people talking about this more recently, characters aren't necessarily allistic by default. I mean, I know that's the default in how people like to think of them, but just like headcanons about gender and sexuality, the only reason we assume characters are cishet and neurotypical until proven otherwise is because that's how we think about everybody else in our life. We assume people we interact with are those things because that's what's shown to us in the media. So when we headcanon a character as being different from those things, it's assumed that we have to prove that. But that's only something that we have to prove because the assumption is otherwise. I mean, there's no reason that a character couldn't be autistic unless they're specifically said not to be in canon, and they don't talk about that in canon material. Nobody specifically calls out a character as being not autistic because it's not something that they thought they would have to clarify, And I do think it's perfectly possible to write a character as autistic by accident, and I think that happens more frequently than you might assume, because autism is diagnosed behaviorally. You could look at a character and how they behave in canon and go, I have some thoughts about this. And that's something that people do, and that turns into headcanons. So I think it's a lot more complex sometimes than just being like, hey, I like this character, they're autistic, but I do that too. And I think that's all right as well. We like to see ourselves in fiction, and we don't see ourselves in fiction enough, so we supplement it how we can. But that isn't enough, and it doesn't fully compensate for the lack of good representation out there. And like I said, I think that the types of headcanons that exist and how people think about their headcanons is something to pay attention to if you're the kind of person who's in a position to write an autistic character in something. Because headcanons are a way to see what people are missing in the actual mainstream media representation. So I hope that you find this helpful or informative. If you have anything you want to add, anything you'd like me to talk about in a future video, feel free to comment down below. Viewer interaction is welcomed. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and also I do have a Twitter if you want to follow that for updates on when subtitles are available and stuff like that, because I don't always get those up right when I post the video. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video and have a great day.